Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session of morbidity and mortality meeting. For those of you who may not be very familiar with what we do in an M&M, let me give you a 2-minute, 3-minute introduction. I believe that an M&M is an extremely important conventional teaching tool. The common myth or a wrong impression about M&M is that it is a kind of a consultant bashing, where the department gets together and finds fault with what has been done. Nothing could be farther from the truth. M&M, every senior, every participant understands clearly that there is more than one way of doing something correctly. And very senior surgeons would have been involved with the case. Their skill, their knowledge is definitely respected by everybody. And if there are certain nuances in terms of treatment, certain differences where some other person would have dealt with the same situation a little differently, that is very gently and nicely pointed out. And there will, of course, be a learning point in that, because the younger surgeons in the group will learn that there is another way of approaching it. Perhaps it might have been better, perhaps it might not have been, because we really don't know, but that is another aspect or another point of view. And so, M&Ms have to be welcomed in all departments because there's an overall learning. But more important than the comments made about the way a particular case was treated is the learning that comes from the discussion that occurs from one of the important aspects of the case. What we do is, you have an X amount of work in a department, there will be morbidity and mortality, and you choose one aspect of a case and learn from it, because you go into the depth of an unusual phenomenon, which is not very common, that probably what led to the morbidity or mortality, and you learn from it. And that aspect of M&M is a lot more important to my mind than the critique of the management of a case. With this brief introduction, I hand the session over to Hari, who will be talking to us about a very interesting case of chronic liver disease with GI bleed. And we will learn certain interesting aspects of varices, particularly ectopic varices. Over to you, Hari.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. I welcome you all to this morbidity and mortality meet. I am Dr. Hari, second year DNB resident from Sagar Hospital. To start with, we start the statistics of the surgeries and general surgery department of Sagar Hospital. On the December month 2020, a total number of cases 35 was done, of which 21 was major and 14 was minor surgeries. And there were 2 mortality and 1 morbidity cases. And I have chosen this mortality case, which is severe variceal bleeding secondary to the chronic liver disease with portal hypertension. Moving on to the case, this is about a 43-year-old gentleman who was admitted from emergency in the evening. He was a known case of chronic liver disease for 5 years, who was on medical treatment and with a surgical history of previous gastric perforation. And he's a known alcohol abuse for 20 years. He was presented with the complaints of multiple episodes of black-colored stools since the past 3 days. And it was also have a complaint of passing fresh blood per rectum since the last 2 days, with more number of episodes, 3 to 4 episodes from the day of admission. And patient doesn't have any other history like abdominal pain, fever, vomiting, or distension. Looking briefly into his past history, like I said, he is a known chronic liver disease patient for 5 years, was on medical management, and patient previous history of upper GI scopy, which was done 3 years ago, found to have esophageal varices, grade 3, and banding was done. And with looking at the surgical history, patient had a gastric perforation, which led to peritonitis, and he was operated 2 years back. And there are no other medical comorbidities. These are all the past history which we collect from the patient at the time of admission. And on examination, patient was...
Hari, I'll stop you a little bit. Do you have information as to why the patient had a gastric perforation?
No, sir. There was no recorded history, but like from the history from the attendance, we could know that it was an emergency surgery. Gastric perforation was done.
Okay.
Otherwise, there is no other history, sir.
So we have to presume that it is some kind of a benign gastric ulcer.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Go on.
So looking at his the examination. Yes, sir.
Dr. Shivaram wants you to go a bit slow. So please go a bit slow.
Okay, sir. So looking at the examination of the patient was moderately built and nourished. He was conscious and well-oriented. Patient has severe pallor and icterus and also bilateral pitting pill edema. And looking at the vitals of the patient was tachycardic, and otherwise the blood pressure, saturation, and other vitals are normal. The systemic examination of the patient and CVS and RS examination was normal. Per abdomen, patient abdomen was soft and there was no distension, and there was no ascites, no shifting dullness for the patient, and bowel sounds were heard. During the rectal examination, patient had blood clots and also internal hemorrhoids, is grade 2, but there is no active bleeding per rectal. And CNS examination, patient has flapping tremors. And coming to the summary of the patient, this is a 43-year-old gentleman with known chronic liver disease and with portal hypertension. He presented to emergency with history of melena and hematochezia, and he had pallor and icterus. Otherwise, the vitals grossly normal. And with the summary, we give to the differential diagnosis of lower GI bleed, which is secondary to varices, and if also upper GI bleed, which is a massive bleed. These are the differential diagnoses we worked with and started for the management of the patient. So looking at the investigation which was done in the emergency, is
Hari, yes, can I stop you here?
Yes, sir.
And involve the first years. Who is here? Madan Gopal is here. Just go back one slide, Hari. Now, with this summary, he says lower GI secondary to ectopic varices is probably more important than an upper GI bleed. Why would he say that, Madan? Is it correct in the first instance?
Sir, yes, sir.
Why do you think lower GI is more likely?
So, because of there is absence of symptoms of upper GI bleed, such as coughing up of blood or hematemesis as such.
Well, but then the patient had melena. He presented with a 3-day history of melena. And it later became hematochezia, and there were fresh blood clots. Yeah. The point there is, if somebody had an upper GI bleed, gastric or esophageal, then if somebody has hematochezia, fresh blood clots, they must have a massive bleed. And if it is that bad, they're likely to be in shock. This patient was undoubtedly tachycardic, but he had maintained his blood pressure. So it's more likely, we are not ruled out upper GI, but more likely he will have a lower GI. By the way, what is the definition of an upper GI and a lower GI bleed?
Bleeding distal to ligament of Treitz is considered lower GI bleed. So
correct. Go on, Hari. Please go with the investigations.
Thank you, sir. Coming to the investigations, which are done in the emergency department, his patient's hemoglobin was found to be 6.4, and the other major the differences in the investigations, like he's a known CLT patient, his LFT was elevated and ammonia was 282, and the platelets was also 76,000, and the INR was 3.11. Otherwise, his electrolytes and renal function test and other ECG and X-ray was normal. So with this, we decided to do the ultrasound abdomen and pelvis for the patient. Here, it showed the liver small in size, and portal vein shows a reversal of flow, and other chlorolithiasis with cholecystitis, and there is no obvious mass or any other collection in as per the ultrasound abdomen pelvis. And with this, we started thinking about the diagnosis with several severe anemia secondary to GI bleed, query variceal bleed, and patient have thrombocytopenia, and with the background of diagnosis, acute on chronic liver disease with portal hypertension, hyperammonemia, and coagulopathy. So from here, the patient, regarding the management, patient was shifted to the ICU for continuous vital monitoring and further treatment. And RT, Ryle's tube was put, and a continuous and fourth aspiration was done. And patient was started on IV fluids, and he was kept NPO. And a proton pump inhibitors infusion was started. He was started on antibiotics, vitamin K, and thiamine. And it was decided to give at 1 unit PRBC transfusion for the patient, and adequate blood and blood products were arranged. With this, we have given reference to the medical gastroenterologist for the further advice.
Stop you.
Yes, sir. Sir? Sir, you're muted, sir.
Okay. Instead of muting somebody else, I muted myself. Sorry. Let me go to Ajit. Ajit, at this point in time, is there any comment you would like to make about the line of management? And I would also like you to go through the justification for each of these steps taken.
Sir, I think they have done the right thing, sir.
Okay.
They have inserted a Ryle's tube to see if there is any blood coming in the Ryle's tube, to rule out the active.
Is there a contraindication for Ryle's tube when an esophageal varices is suspected? Can you damage the varices and worsen the bleeding when you put a Ryle's tube in?
Sir, unlikely, sir.
Yeah, that's the correct answer. Unlikely, because it's more important for you to know whether there's an upper GI bleed or not, and empty the stomach, because one of the problems with any upper GI, big upper GI bleed is aspiration. So it's good to keep it under control. Prevent aspiration. Okay. You have a good wide bore IV fluid, that's fine. Okay.
Then proton pump inhibitors are necessary, sir. As in management of any upper.
Why is it required? Suppose the patient has. Yeah, go on. You're saying something. Let me not interrupt you. Yeah. Why is PPI required?
To decrease the acidity in the stomach, sir.
Why? See, your working diagnosis is chronic liver disease. Why would you want a PPI? APD is 25% more often seen in CLD patients than the normal population. Okay, the incidence of hyperacidity and features DU, antral gastritis, and features of acid peptic disease is a lot more common in people with CLD. That's why PPI is justified. Okay, why an antibiotic? I want the students to know why we do what we do, and that's something which you should just reel off.
Sir, if there is any perforation, to prevent.
Why are you thinking of perforation? This patient has a GI bleed. We just mentioned something. Just 2 minutes ago, I mentioned something. We talked about aspiration.
Yes, aspiration.
There is a higher incidence of lung infection.
Yes.
What is the immune status of a patient with chronic liver disease?
His immunity will be low,
yes,
sir.
He is severely immunocompromised.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and because of bacterial translocation that occurs later, these people are very prone to septicemia, all right? Systemic sepsis. So it's reasonable to start an antibiotic straight away. And he talked about a 1 unit PRBC transfusion. Is that correct?
No, sir. Actually, 1 unit, we have always been taught that 1 unit will, if you want to give 1 unit, then there is no point in giving. At least
yes.
you should
and,
give
yes. And his hemoglobin was 6.4. So if you, what would be the kind of hemoglobin you would like in a patient like this?
Sir, minimum 8, 7 or 8.
Yeah, 7 or 8 if there is no cardiac disease, at 10 if there is a cardiac compromise.
Yes, sir.
So how much would each unit of PRBC increase your hemoglobin? Provided he has no ongoing bleed, which he is most likely to have. But let us say he has no further bleeding. Your hemoglobin is 6.4, keep it at 6. If you want to bring it up to 10, how much should you give?
Around 4 units, sir.
Yeah, correct. Each unit gives you 1 gram hemoglobin approximately. And I'm sure more was given, but at this point in time, Hari has mentioned that only 1 was given. So I'm sure more was cross-matched and more was given. He's also said arranged packed cells and platelets and FFP. Why would you need platelets in a patient with CLD?
Sir, there will be
thrombocytopenia. I want you to reel off the answers for this year. What is the state of the spleen in hypertension?
There will be thrombocytopenia, sir.
Yes, because of a splenomegaly and sequestration. There may also be an element of autoimmunity to platelets. So platelets will be low in CLD. And why FFP?
To even stop the bleeding, platelet aggregation will stop the bleeding.
Yes.
Also.
And FFP?
FFP because his INR was raised. So
correct.
To correction of that.
Why not vitamin K? He mentioned about vitamin K also. He has given vitamin K, but why give FFP in addition? Ajit, you are a final year man. That's why I chose you. I thought you would reel off. How long does it take for the vitamin K to take effect to correct the coagulation in a patient with CLD?
24 to 48 hours.
3 days. Okay, 48 to 72 hours. And if the CLD is bad, all right, it may never come up because they will never have the capacity to produce the factors if the CLD is bad. That's why you got to give the coagulation pathway factors through FFP straight away. All right. So
yes,
those
one more comment.
I want to make. Yes.
I think output monitoring he has not mentioned.
Yes, output.
Urine output monitoring is important.
Fair enough. I'm sure he would have done it, but he has not mentioned it. There's one more thing that you can do to reduce the portal hypertension. After all, your working diagnosis is portal hypertension, CLD. So what else could have been done? I'm sure it was done, but not mentioned in this slide. Yeah. What would you do to reduce the portal pressure? You would give somatostatin or its analogs, octreotide.
Octreotide.
Okay. You would give an infusion of this to reduce the portal pressure. All right. So, Hari, please carry on. Gastro reference was done for an OGD. Fine, go on.
So I just wanted to mention a point about the Rockall score. One of the major challenges in managing the GI bleed involves identification of the patients who are at the risk of rebleeding and death. So there are many scores, and in which the Rockall score is most used one. It is developed to assess the risk of death, and as I can see, the score incorporates patients' age and hemodynamics and comorbidities and also endoscopic findings. With this, I can classify the patient with low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. And with this patient have a Rockall score of 6, which is indicating of rebleeding risk of 32% and mortality risk of 17%. And with this, it indicates a necessity for an urgent upper GI scopy. So on the day one, he was admitted on the night. On the day one, the morning hemoglobin was 6.4, and the coagulation profile, the INR value was 3.8, and the rest of the investigation, as you can see. Like I mentioned, the bedside scopy was planned. For upper GI scopy, there was no foci of active bleeding at first, and impression was given like portal hypertensive gastropathy with the congested mucosa of fundus body and antrum. And with this, there was no active bleeding. Patient was started on terlipressin and LOLA, yellow ornithine elaspirate, and patient was monitored.
I'll stop you there for a sec, because Ravi Shankar has made a point. Ravi, can you please come in and talk about the antibiotic that you have raised?
I think Taxim is probably not the right antibiotic to give. If you want, for all the things that you explained to prevent systemic sepsis, aspiration, and Taxim is not very effective in the upper respiratory tract. It is not effective in very severe systemic sepsis. I think a better antibiotic should have been either, whether it is piperacillin, tazobactam.
Taxim is not a broad spectrum
antibiotic at all. So ticarcillin or piperacillin with tazobactam and things like that would be more appropriate.
I would agree with that. Shivram, your views?
Oh, this is an upper GI bleed. So we start cefuroxime first, a broad spectrum, and if necessary, then we can upstage the antibiotic.
Right.
This is only prophylactic.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Go on, Hari.
Sir, I want to come in, sir.
Yes. Go.
Sir, lactulose should we give in this patient?
Yes.
Yes, sir, support.
Yes. It should be given. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Go on, Hari.
So on day 2, colonoscopy, bedside colonoscopy was done, which also showed there was no active bleeding, and the colonoscopy was done till the ileocecal junction. The only finding was the internal hemorrhage was grade 2, and like a hemorrhoidal banding of the internal hemorrhage was also done. This is the image showing the band ligation. On the day 2
just one sec, Hari. At this point in time,
yes, sir.
You have not found a bleeding point in upper GI tract.
Yes, sir.
You have not found anything in the lower, the colon, other than a hemorrhoid.
Yes.
Are you reasonably convinced with the degree of bleed he has had and the anemia that he has had? Are you reasonably happy with what you have found, or would you be very worried that you have not found a source of an important bleed?
No, sir. We'd be obviously worried about the we couldn't find an active bleeding or any source of bleeding, sir.
Correct.
With the hemoglobin being 6.4.
Correct. You would be worried that there is something that is happening. And because you have cleared the upper GI and the colon, it's probably the small bowel.
Yes, sir.
That is something you must have. Yeah. One important point you should have mentioned
yes,
in
sir.
your colonoscopic finding is to say, up to what you said the colon was normal, but what was the situation as far as the luminal blood was concerned? Was it seen right up to the cecum? Even if you give a preparation, it can't be completely clear. So did they find traces of blood even in the cecum?
No, sir. I'm not putting this full image. As per this thing, there was no traces of blood also was there, sir.
Not even in the cecum or the ileocecal junction?
No, sir. Only in the terminal part, the blood clots were there, sir. But otherwise, there is no in the colon.
Terminal part means where?
I mean, in the rectal region, sir.
In the rectum. Okay, that is very, very unusual, because even if you are given a preparation, you would expect some traces of blood in the cecum if you had a bleed from the small intestine. If there is no blood at all, then of course there's a big question mark. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Moving on to the day 2, the same day, hemoglobin was still dropping to 6.8, and patient was transfused blood products for optimization, and still the patient was bleeding. And the next day, there was 2 to 3 episodes of melena, and hence it was decided to go for CT scan of abdomen and pelvis, plain and angiogram, which showed there was no active contrast extravasation into the bowel lumen. And other CLD changes and portal hyperactive features were also seen. And this was the image showing the angiogram. And there is no evidence of bleeding present other than the investigation. And patient was monitored and optimized in the day 4. The hemoglobin there was no evidence of bleeding, no melena on the day 4. And patient hemoglobin raised till 8.3, and we continued other optimization and care for the patient. And on the day 5, again, patient started having melena episodes, and patient's hemoglobin was dropping. And you can see the other blood parameters here. So it was discussed among the physician and gastroenterologist and other intervention radiologists as well. And it was decided to go for an RBC tagged radioiodine scan, which was a patient was shifted to outside scan center, and it was done. And this scan showed active intestinal bleeding, evidence of active intestinal bleeding, likely the small intestine. As per colonoscopy shows normal large bowel. So this was an impression they were given in the scan. And patient, this image shows evidence of active bleeding in the radioiodine scan.
Just one sec, Hari. Janani, can I bring you in? Between an angiogram, be it a physical angiogram with cannulation of the vessels, or a CT angiogram, or a tagged red cell study for GI bleed, which one would you choose, and which one would give you more accurate information? And when? That's the important thing.
So I think she went to emergency.
Went to an emergency. So who else can I call? Hari, you said Indraja, it's too much for her. You tell me yourself, Hari. Which one would you do? You did both, of course. But
Yes,
is there something that would tell you, I would do red cell, tagged red cell now, or I would do an angiogram now?
Sir, I would like
We have
to go
discussed
with
this before many times.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I'd like to go with the CT angiogram, sir, because as we know, the RBC tag scan does not show the exact location of the bleeding, and the information it can show only there is an active bleeding.
Yes.
And also with the angiogram, we can go do embolization also to control the bleeding.
That is true, but that is with a catheter. But you did a CT angiogram.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but that wouldn't help you to give therapeutic methods.
Yes, sir.
All right. But is there anything about the rate of bleeding for you to show positivity?
The bleeding will be like 0.5 to 1. I'm not sure about the value, sir. So
1
you can
ml per minute for an angiogram.
Yes, sir.
It is 0.3 ml per minute for a tagged red cell. Yes. So tagged red cell will show you even if you have a smaller bleeding rate, a lower bleeding rate. Yes, but as you rightly said, localization is very difficult with tagged red cells. All right. Yes, please carry on. Yeah.
So patient shifted back on the same day, and here, as we can see, is hemodynamic blood investigations. So patient was given the blood and blood products, maybe because of that hemoglobin is raised, but patient continued to have melena, and patient. His clinical condition, he still found to have tachycardic, and patient still the same. So it was decided just before going into further progress of this class, I just wanted to put few information about the Child's Pew score and MEL score. So this Child Pew score.
Why do you want to put this information?
Sir, because if planned for the next step, sir, like surgery or about the survival, so we should know about the.
That is it. Not next step. If you're thinking surgery, yes, you must know about the possible risks.
Yes, sir.
Particularly mortality. That's why these two things come. And so before any surgeon thinks of surgery, when the patient has ongoing bleeding, you are given a lot of blood and the hemoglobin is not coming up. So it's very correct that you think about MELD and child score. Go on.
Yes. So this looking at Child Pew score, this was designed to actually to predict the mortality in patients with cirrhosis. But not only for this, like sir said, but also can predict the mortality risk associated with other major abdominal surgeries also. Likely in this patient, you can undergo. For example, in this patient, you can see the Child Pew score, which is calculated using the blood parameters like bilirubin, albumin, and INR, and looking at the encephalopathy status of the patient. And this was calculated, and we can see the Child Pew score of 9 out of 15, which comes under class B. So it can also give the child score of class B patient with 30% mortality risk if he goes for any major abdominal surgeries. And the 1 year survival of this patient is 80%. Moving on to the MEL score. This score reflects the function of not only the liver, also the kidney, liver, and extensive coagulative pathway, everything. And it is used as a general prognostic tool for the assessment of the patient. And primarily being used to allocate the liver transplant patients in the list. And for this patient, the MEL score was 22. And the estimated 3-month mortality was 19.6%. So with this background,
okay, I'll stop you here for a minute, Hari. Shrikant has a very valid question. Is there a role for capsule endoscopy?
Yes,
in
sir.
This patient?
Yes, sir.
Why would you do that?
We can consider capsule endoscopy, sir, because it was negative in upper GI and lower GI endoscopy. But considering the status of the patient and the availability of capsule endoscopy, is not recommended, sir.
Capsule endoscopy is usually designed for chronic bleed. This is an acute bleed. And so it is unlikely that you will get a lot of useful information with the capsule endoscopy. It takes time. And if there's a lot of blood and if it's intermittent bleeding, of course, you will not see much of it. And there may or may not be an obvious lesion. And even if you see a lesion, you don't know whether that is causing the bleeding or not. For these reasons, particularly because it is an acute bleed, capsule endoscopy is something that you would not consider on a regular basis. Can I get the other seniors in for their comments? Ravi?
Hari, I agree with you, sir. I think capsule endoscopy is cumbersome and it is difficult to interpret, and especially in acute situation, not very useful. Hari, I think child Pew score is probably more useful. MELD score is mainly, as you said, used for stratification of the patient, for liver transplant.
Yes, sir.
Because we are not considering liver transplant in this patient at the present time.
Yes,
I think child Pew score is probably more, pertinent and useful.
I agree with that, but I asked him to put the MELD score also for people to know that that's one of the parameters which is designed to look at the severity of the liver disease and its impact on various interventions. That was the reason we put it. I agree with you that a child Pew score is a lot more important. Coming back to capsule,
one more question. You
put Ravi, I'll get you in. Now, let me first get the other views on capsule endoscopy. Shivram?
Fully agree. It is for the chronic situations. Actually, people have now moved away from capsule endoscopy also, because when you do a colonoscopy, we can go to ileum and look at ileoscopy also. And a lot of people do push enteroscopy from above also. So lot of the intestinal information can be obtained by endoscopy. And many times when we used earlier the capsule endoscopy, it got stuck in the small bowel. And in 2 occasions, we had to operate and remove the capsule endoscopy, and it didn't give much information.
Niranjan? Voice is breaking, Niranjan. Maybe your bandwidth is not very good.
Agree, sir.
Better now.
Capsule endoscopy is more for obscure GI bleed rather than in a case of acute GI bleed.
All right, that answers that question. Ravi, you had another question to ask of Hari.
Yeah, Hari.
Yes, sir.
You said mortality is 19.6%.
Yes, sir.
Can you put it into perspective? Is it low? Is it high? Or is it acceptable at that stage of the disease?
Sir, with him in the background, that is high only, sir.
It is very high because normally we have a mortality for elective case of 1 to 2% and in emergency about 5%. So this is about 4 times that. So it is very high.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes.
Please
sir,
go on.
I want to comment, sir. Sir, I want to comment, sir.
Oh, go on. Sorry, Ajit, go on. Yeah.
Sir, I think Hari, go to MELD score. Sir, in this, I think they have added sodium, sir.
The modified MELD score, yes, sir. I just wanted to put a broad, idea about it, so I didn't include that.
Sodium and dialysis, if it is twice a week.
Correct, sir. Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Go on, Hari.
To proceed further, like I said, this is discussed with a gastroenterologist, surgeon, vascular surgeon, interventional radiologist, and anesthetist about the decision of the surgery. And it was decided for surgery after the optimization of the patient in the given time. And with the view of multiple comorbidities, the patient was taken up for surgery under high risk on the next day morning.
Just one sec, Hari. Subhash, can I bring you in? And please share with us your thoughts at that point in time after you had the discussion with your colleagues. What was your plan of action for surgery? Yeah.
Discussion was with Vijay Kumar sir to have he wanted laparoscopy. I said there is no role for laparoscopy. Let us go in and see what it is, because we had given more than 5 days time. It had not stopped. So we had to go in and see what is the problem.
And what was your plan of action? What did you think would the possibilities were? And
maybe some small intestinal bleed only, some varicose bleed. Maybe that was in my mind.
Okay.
So we went for a direct laparotomy.
All right. Go ahead.
The intramural bleeding, can it be seen on laparotomy?
Pardon me, sir?
Intramural bleeding, can it be seen on laparotomy?
Intraluminal bleed.
Yeah.
That is what, and also its plan was to a on-table scopy of the small bowel.
Correct. See, Shrikant, to answer your question, it depends on where the blood is. There will be some retrograde bleeding, but if you have no blood in jejunum and blood only in ileum, for example, you can expect that blood bleeding point to be somewhere in the distal small bowel. by a process of elimination, you can narrow down. And if you are in doubt, as Subhash said, an on-table endoscopy is a very neat method of finding out where the bleed is. Okay, go ahead, Hari.
Yes, sir. So,
can I come in?
Yeah, please.
So we can do laparoscopy, trace the bowel all the way, and see where is the blood, and only pull out that portion of the intestine with a small incision, and then do an enteroscopy instead of giving a big laparotomy. So that's the advantage of doing a laparoscopy, and then do a smaller. It can minimize the major surgery into a little lesser surgery.
Yes, that's a very valid point. Yeah. Go on, Hari.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir. So with this, patient was taken for surgery, and exploratory laparotomy was done. And we found the dense adhesion of bowel to the previous laparotomy scar. And moving further, the abnormal dilated varices were seen near the umbilical region where we opened of the anterior abdominal wall. And exploring bowel, and we found minimal interbowel adhesions as well. And the main important finding is an abnormal variceal connection to the distal ileum from the urinary bladder region, which is like very in heavy malformation. And hence it was decided to go for resection of this variceal segment and bowel anastomosis. We also did clamping of a few bowel segments to find out any collections of the blood, but there was no other evidence of any other blood collection or any active bleeding. So this was a procedure done, and thorough bowel work done to identify the source of bleed, and the abdominal connections were noted, carefully ligated and divided, with the involved small part of bowel segment was also removed with that. And end-to-end bowel anastomosis was done, and thorough check was done for any other bleeding. And in the end, hemostasis was achieved and drain placed, and we closed the abdomen.
Hari, and, you have to explain where you found the blood. Was it all over the small bowel? Was it in some part of the small bowel?
Sir, we didn't find any blood collected in the bowel, sir, but we found that abnormal connection only. So in where we had doubt, we had some clamped the bowel and look for any collection after some time, but we couldn't find any other evidence of any bleed, sir. Only this was found, and we took a opinion of senior surgeon as well. So it was decided to go for resection anastomosis, sir.
If you don't find, it's a question to you first, and then of course Subhash will be able to answer us. Yes, if you don't find any blood in the bowel, and you find an abnormal connection with a varix between your bowel and anterior abdominal wall and the bladder and other areas, how do you know what is bleeding?
Yes, sir. Actually, sir, to answer that, we decided to go for intraoperative endoscopy, sir, to find the exact location. So even we had gastroenterologist nearby in the OT, but the lesion was very obvious that it has connection. Abnormal IV malformation was seen, and also in view of the patient, we finished surgery to minimize the intraoperative time also. So it was decided to go for resection anastomosis of the specimen, sir.
Subhash, you want to add anything here?
I think you should have shown the photos by this now. Then you would have got the confirmation that, again, this is the first picture, we can see the variceal from the mesentery going on to the anti-mesenteric border and connecting to the urinary bladder.
Okay.
On the dome of the surface. So with this nice variceal vessel seen, we thought this is the cause of bleed, and we disconnected it and resected it.
Okay. So and there were no other such connections elsewhere.
No other connections. Okay. And we had put multiple clamps for the small bowel. We didn't find any collection elsewhere also. So we didn't do on-table scopy also for the bowel. Enteroscope for the bowel.
Okay. Any other comments from the seniors? Ravi?
Usually after putting the clamp, how long do you wait, sir?
No, sir, I think
to see the collection.
No, we were just searching for all
No. Just asking how long one should wait on the, if in case you get it.
I mean, I don't.
Difficult to say because there was no collection. So clamping in this particular case might not help very much.
At least how long you waited, sir? Subhash.
Sir, we see this was because the previous history of
case bandre anta.
Sir. it was previous case of laparotomy. There was some adhesions also. So we took some time in releasing adhesions. So that time was sufficient for us to see if there is any collection in the bowel.
Fresh collection.
Okay.
Fair enough. Ravi, your comments?
30 minutes to 40 minutes. So we first started clamping, sir. Then only we found this and resected aneurysm. Till the time the clamp was there. So it should be around 30 to 40 minutes according to me, sir.
All right. Ravi?
Sir, I wanted to ask Subhash, did you do a hand-sewn anastomosis or a stapled anastomosis?
Hand-sewn anastomosis, sir.
Okay.
Anybody else? Nuli, sir, can you come in and do you have any comments at this stage?
No, sir. I just wanted to ask this AV malformation. I'm seeing first time that too, the urinary bladder, sir. So yeah. I just want to know about that, sir.
Yeah. Hari called it an AV malformation, but it looks more like an ectopic varix to me. All right. Yes. So we will be discussing it as we go along, sir. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay.
All right.
We can see one more photo above in the which is showing the umbilicus.
This is the umbilicus here.
This is umbilicus below that. This is a small ball, but this much big bulge. So it was very difficult for us to process also, sir. The huge varices were there.
Yeah.
In fact, we were lucky we didn't open it when opening the abdomen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sir, I think Niranjan here, I think the histopathology also confirms it was a ectopic varix rather than a...
That will come later. That will come later. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Hari?
Yes, sir.
All these were not picked up with the CT and CT angio, all those things?
No, sir. No, sir.
I think we should go back and see the CT. No, it should be able to look at, maybe retrospectively, we can look at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. But again, the biggest problem with all these investigations is that it becomes positive only when there is active bleeding at the time of the investigation, you know. And the bleeds here are typically intermittent, and that's why you miss out on a lot of these. Physically, were they able to see these varices? I have my doubts. Even though they look pretty big on the picture here, physically it may not come out, and they'll probably see an overall picture of portal hypertension, but to localize these varices on a CT is probably very, very difficult. Go on, Hari, please.
Sir, two things here. We had discussed regarding this in our morbidity mortality, where Dr. Kiran, radiologist, was asked to ask the same question. So why was it not picked up? His comment was because it's a venous bleed. CT angio will not pick up until and unless it's a very profuse bleed.
Yes, that's the correct point.
The second point is, and the second point is, they give nowadays they give the mannitol based contrast. So to pick up a mucosal lesion, we have to give a gastrographin based contrast.
Yeah.
So so that was the main difference why they were not able to pick up that varix.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Go on, Hari.
Yes. So patient was shifted back to ICU for continuous monitoring. Patient was not extubated, he was on ventilatory support in CAV mode and sedated. And for the day one, there was no active bleeding or melena. And next day, the drain was 700 ml, which was serosanguinous. And the patient's vitals were stable. He was not on any inotropes. So there was no RT aspiration at that point, and the further transfusion of blood and blood products was done. On the left side, I have given the investigations for that day, highlighting the hemoglobin, which is 7.1. On day 2, patient was still on ventilator support, and patient have a continuous PPI infusion, and drain was 850 ml, which is serosanguinous, and there was no patient doesn't pass any motion. There was no evidence of bleeding as well in the same day. So we continued to monitor the patient and transfuse the patient and get the hemoglobin to the limits, and other supportive measurements managements were done. And on day 3, patient passed stools, which in which there was no melena and bleeding. Patient passed normal stools, and as you can see, there is a minimal RT aspiration, and drain was also coming down, and hemoglobin was increased to 8.6. And the day 4,
in short, there was no GI bleed after surgery.
Yes, sir. Yes,
patient's aspirate came down, there was no melena, and the hemoglobin came up.
And he passed normal stools.
And he put out 600 ml of drain fluid.
Yes.
It's quite a bit. What do you think is happening there?
Sir, he is a CLD patient, maybe ascites. And
correct. He's draining his ascites. Go on.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was decided to stop the sedation and wean the patient off, but there was a problem in weaning a patient who couldn't go for a spontaneous breathing. So he was continued to monitor on SIMV ventilation, and otherwise the hemodynamics was stable, and he moved bowels again 3 times, there was no bleeding, which was normal stool. Since RT aspiration was not there, patient was started on RT feeds, 30 ml high protein RT feeds, and the plan was to correct the coagulopathy and get the patient to be extubated.
Just one sec. I'll take a couple of questions from the chat box. Madan asks, what is the reason for the failure of colonoscopy or intraoperative enteroscopy in a patient with melena? You're asking a general question, Madan. Unmute yourself. Or is it in this patient that you're talking about?
No, sir. In general, sir.
In general. If there is no lesion in the colon, colonoscopy will be negative. Intraoperative enteroscopy is hardly ever negative. Almost always it is positive. Only sometimes what happens is that small AV malformations, they look like very small red spots, and you will never know which one. You will know that there are AV malformations, but the failure will be not in recognizing these red spots, but the failure may be in not recognizing where it is bleeding from. There will be multiple small red spots all over. And if there is no active bleeding at that time, intraoperative enteroscopy may not show you which one is bleeding. So as a surgeon, you don't know where you have to resect. But there is a role for steroids in these patients with multiple, AV malformations all over the telangiectasia, as they are called, all over the small bowel. There is some low-level evidence that steroids may help in reducing further bleeding from these patients. Okay, go on, Hari. Sorry, there is another question. Ravi asks, why cryoprecipitate?
Sir, for patient prepared from plasma and other factors are there, sir. So, I don't know at this point. Why, sir?
Yeah, because I think it was a desperate move. I'm guessing. Subhash, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Theoretically, 2, 7, 9, 10. That is the internal pathway. They are the ones that are affected by chronic liver disease. And cryoprecipitate gives you factor 8, which is a separate entity. Usually that's not what causes the problem in a chronic liver disease. But as my guess is, Ravi, that as the coagulopathy never improved in this patient, they gave that also, just to have a go and see if that helps. Yeah. Theoretically, it would not help. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yes, sir.
Sir, I agree with you, but it would have been better off giving recombinant factor 7. Yeah. Labile factor. That would have been probably better, but it's probably expensive. That's why they've been doing.
Ajit, you have something to say?
Sir, in textbooks that it is given that when we do massive transfusion, there is hypofibrinogenemia.
Correct.
And since we are giving him blood, this patient regularly, we are giving him blood.
Yeah.
So to correct that.
Yeah. All right. That's one way of looking at it. I agree. Yeah. Go on. Go on, Hari.
Yes, sir.
See, because we're getting on in time, I would like a discussion on ectopic varices. So please skip through the next few slides.
Yes, sir.
Having seen this, let me summarize to the audience here that this patient deteriorated basically through continuing and worsening coagulopathy and neurological disturbance because of chronic liver disease, and succumbed to his disease even though he had no active bleeding intraluminally on what, day 8, day 9, or something like that, post-op. Is that right?
Yes, sir. They started having in a fever spike.
The only time he had bleeding was a pre-terminal event when he was oozing all over. He had a melena into the gut. He was bleeding from the abdominal wall and bleeding from everywhere because of his very severe coagulopathy. All right. Is that correct, Hari?
Yes, sir. Correct, sir.
Yeah.
So you can see the repeat OGD-scopy, blood reflexing, and also a patient having hematuria, hematochezia, etc. Sir.
All right. So in short, in spite of an recognition and removal of an offending variceal bleeding segment, the patient succumbed to general disease in the form of sepsis, coagulopathy, and encephalopathy. All right.
Yes, sir.
So we have, is there any comment on the case that any of my senior colleagues would like to make? Because if there isn't, we will move on to ectopic varices as a part of discussion, because there is some learning for all of us in that.
Sir,
go on.
I want to comment. Sir, actually, Subhash sir mentioned this that day only. Because when we have difficult case like this where decision making is difficult for a surgeon,
yeah,
we should have like a proper panel discussion among all the team, because
yes,
every consultant will come at other different times.
Yes.
So it should be coordinated and panel discussion, and then how to go about this case. This
Yes.
Subhash sir had mentioned that day only.
Yes.
So
yes.
it should happen when the patient is alive.
Right. All right.
This can be done on Zoom also.
On Zoom nowadays, we have learned, yes. So if
do.
there's a difficult case, just call for a quick meeting, you know, and then 3-4 minds working together, and then you can help the consultant decide on what needs to be done. All right, that's a good idea. Yeah. Okay, 15 post-op day, we lost the patient. Now, can you please go ahead and give us a little rundown on the ectopic varices, please?
Okay. So just one point about this, sir. I just finish it off.
Yes.
So, like, sir, for the completion, the histopathology we discussed with pathologists, sir.
Yes.
So the section from the resected part shows tortuous dilated blood vessels in the submucosa and focally in the subserosa also, and focal clustering of blood vessels seen in the submucosa. And they say the features as favoring AV malformation.
Right.
And this was the slides given by the pathologist after sectioning this, sir. So as we can see, this is a normal histology, and like you see here, the dilated blood vessel here in the mucosa, and say large prominent dilated tortuous blood vessels in the submucosa in this specimen, and here this tortuous blood reaching up to till the mucosal surfaces. So this was suggestive of AV malformation itself, sir.
I would still not call it an arteriovenous malformation. I would still call it ectopic varices.
Yes.
Because this has come, AV malformation is usually a malformation in the wall of the stomach, of the bowel, okay, of the viscus. But here you have clearly shown us a picture where the varices is outside the bowel, and it has gone into the bowel.
Yes, sir.
And then it's opened into the bowel and it has bled. So you would still call it an ectopic varice.
His point was like these are the evidences to show that the bleeding was there in the cut section.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, go on.
So to quote one similar review of literature comparing with this patient, this is almost similar. Like 50-year-old man with who having the ileocecal variceal bleeding, where initially they did the hemoclips with after colonoscopy, and patient again having had a massive rebleed. In which the superior mesenteric angiography was done, and also the embolization was done for the patient. Patient again started rebleeding. About 11 to 12 PRBC transfusion was done, and it was decided to go for an emergency laparoscopy, in which they found the abdominal varices in the ileocecal segment. Segmental resection of ileocecum was done, and still the patient died of hepatic failure on the post-operative day 13. So moving on to the discussion about the ectopic varices. Regarding the discussion, the ectopic varices are the most common complication of esophageal varices are the most common complications of cirrhosis. We know that about the esophageal varices, but the ectopic varices are the portosystemic collaterals along the digestive tract outside the gastroesophageal region and are very unusual. This is the definition for ectopic varices. The hemorrhage, but more frequent site for the ectopic varices are the rectum, followed by the duodenum. Here, the hemorrhage from the rectal varices occurs at a very low frequency of 0.5 to 3.6%. And regarding the duodenum, here the duodenal varices is generally massive and fatal, but the occurrence is very rare. So the bleeding from jejunal and ileal varices may be massive and serious, and it is difficult to achieve early diagnosis. And even the diagnosis and subsequent treatment is also difficult in ectopic varices. So this another paper showed about the update on the management of gastrointestinal varices. The 6-week mortality rate among the patients with index variceal bleeding, which is approximately 20%, and the risk of rebleeding without the ectopic endoscopy intervention is 60%, and an increased mortality rate of 33%. So the concluding that the newer modality in endoscopy and interventional radiology will be helpful to reduce the further morbidity and mortality related to the variceal and ectopic variceal bleeding. And the further research in its understanding is very important to revolutionize management of portal hypertension and its complications. Till now, there was no consensus for the treatment of ectopic varices, ectopic variceal bleeding. So this is a small chart to conclude about the follow-up of the patient. So patient with the compensated cirrhosis, screening endoscopy should be done, which shows if there is no varices are not there, so we can go for endoscopy for 3-year follow-up. If varices are not there with ongoing liver injury, endoscopy should be done every 2 years. If the screening endoscopy showed varices, and if it is a small varices with a no liver injury, ongoing liver injury, endoscopy is still considered for 2 years once. And if there is an ongoing liver injury with small varices, for yearly endoscopy should be done. For example, if the patient with a moderate large varices,
I will stop you here because this is not for ectopic varices. So let us focus on ectopic varices. Go to the next slide, please.
This was the 2 slides I put on ectopic, and this to conclude. Yes,
we are concluding. Before you conclude, please stop sharing. Because there are 1 or 2 important things that you have not mentioned.
Okay.
Because there were other papers, I think, which you perhaps did not see. But it's okay. I will show you something that is important. Then
ectopic varices along adhesions. Intra-abdominal adhesion. Ectopic varices can occur along intra-abdominal adhesions.
Yes.
That's exactly what happened in this patient.
Correct. So please understand that ectopic varices, as you say, is varices outside the gastroesophageal region. They can occur, different papers give you different incidences. Some people say that rectal is the commonest, as you have mentioned, but many other papers say that duodenal varices are most common, and they become much more common as you deal with the esophageal varices. What happens is that when you band the varices, or when you sclerose the esophageal and gastric varices, the portal hypertension persists or even gets worse. And so the pressure has to be taken up by some other system, and that can occur outside the common areas of the esophagus and the stomach. And they're classified as either luminal or extraluminal. All right, isolated gastric varices. Remember, it's not gastroesophageal, but only gastric. Duodenal, jejunal, ileal, colon, rectum, and peristomal. Whenever there is a stoma, you can have varices there. Extraluminal is what Shivaram also mentioned. It can be intraperitoneal, retroperitoneal. You have collaterals in the retroperitoneal between the SMV and the IMV system. You have collaterals between the liver and the diaphragm. Around the falciform ligament, you have isolated gastric gallbladder varices that have been described. Can be perisplenic. The one right diaphragm is the one I already mentioned, and rarely ovary and vagina. So these are all the areas of ectopic varices, and all of them can bleed at any time. It can be either intraluminal if the varices has gone into the lumen of the gut, or it can be intraperitoneal, which is hemoperitoneum. Okay, these are all the possibilities, and the investigations are what we mentioned, but it is sometimes very difficult to detect. But I will go straight to the options of treatment. Okay, and please note that I will share this paper with you. Okay, you need to first resuscitate the patient, give the vasopressors, and give octreotide or any other somatostatin analog. Endoscopic management, if you can reach it, or interventional radiology techniques. These become important if you have the time and if you find the source of bleeding with your investigation. Surgery, of course, is an option, and many times it's very difficult for us to do anything other than surgery. But what are the possibilities? You can do TIPS, where emergency TIPS can be done. There is another process, balloon occluded retrograde transvenous obliteration. It's basically you occlude the channel and then obliterate the varix, because you don't want the sclerosant that you give to go to the systemic circulation. So you occlude the channel and then sclerose the varix, but it's not something that is commonly done or commonly available. And you can also have a percutaneous transhepatic obliteration, usually used in duodenal. And it's another way of, apart from the TIPS, it's another way of embolization of the varices. This is usually done for duodenal varices. And of course, surgery, when you go in there, resection anastomosis is the most common thing, and that was what was done here. So it's important for all of us to bear in mind that you can have ectopic varices in chronic liver disease. We usually are focused on gastroesophageal varices, but you can have varices elsewhere. And these are some of the tools that are at your disposal to deal with it. All right. Can I now leave it open to our seniors here to make their comments? Ravi.
I think it's a very difficult area to deal with, both medically and surgically. I think the treatment has been done as per protocol. I don't think there is anything to comment on that. And I think it is the liver ultimately which caused the patient. So I think surgically, what should have been done has been done appropriately.
Muli, sir.
Yes, sir. Only thing, sir, I was in Delhi for some training. As you were telling, on Thursday afternoon, they make a Zoom meeting, sir. And in the hospital, where are in different departments, which all are the serious patients, where we are having problem, what will be their prognosis. In that, microbiologist, pathologist, radiologist, surgeon, everyone participates. And that's a good idea of what best can be done for that patient to survive. In spite of all those things, sometimes we lose, that is different. But those coordination between interdepartmental relations, patients will be benefited. That is the idea, sir. And in this case, we have done everything. And that is very appropriately managed. It's okay, sir. But the discussion was very good. But our presenter was at super fast speed. Sometimes I was not able to catch him.
Sorry for
anyway,
that. I tried to cover this thing.
Yeah.
No,
but it's okay. No, just I'm joking. And a lighter this one, I told you. It was a very good case. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Shivaram?
Right, sir. I agree with all of this.
Yeah. Srikanth?
No, nothing to add, sir. Everything is perfect.
All right. Niranjan?
Nothing, sir.
Nishant?
Sir, nothing to add, sir. Everything was covered.
All right. Who else is there? Mahesh is there. I thought I saw his name. Has he left?
Subhash, sir.
Subhash, of course. He will get the final one. That's why I'm still waiting. And who else is Farouk? Is he staff? No? Okay. Final comments from Subhash before we wind up the meeting, please.
Yeah. Nothing as such, but we did our best, but still we could not say him. And sometimes we were also lucky that when we were closing the abdomen, we didn't hit the caput medulla also. Somewhere we were lucky also to have not have on-table massive bleed. That's all, sir. We were lucky and the patient was unlucky.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Next time when you get such a case, do you operate?
We have to.
That's what I'm just.
Yeah, I would operate. I have no doubt about it. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for a very healthy discussion. And I thought what was
thank you.
What
nice
could, what could be
thank
called
you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night, sir.
Very, very apt and very appropriate M&M, and congratulate Hari for his diligent training. But I would give him 2 pieces of advice. You have to keep your time. I almost canceled the session because it was not presented on time, but then I relented and said we should do the session. And second, please talk slowly and deliberately so that you are better heard and better understood. Okay? Thank you very much and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.